Discourse over the past couple of years in the United States reminds me of a quote from Martin Niemöller that I'd like to reword for what I see going on in the education system. First, they came for Black Lives Matter activists, and I did not speak out because I was not black. Then they came for pedagogies that was informed by critical race theory, and I did not speak out because I had not read critical race theory. Then they came for the trans and queer communities, and I did not speak out because I was not trans or queer. Then they came for me, and there is no one left to speak for me. To be clear, I don't think we're approaching the atrocities that occurred during the Holocaust that led to the original quote that I'm rewording, so I don't want to downplay any historical atrocities. But I do fear that people who are remaining silent about policies, discourse, and hegemonic influence over computer science education will one day get to a point where they realize they should have spoken up sooner. Educators in recent years have been punished for their identities or ways of being, such as being gay or trans, as well as for teaching about historical injustices that have occurred and continue to occur as a result of systemic barriers, and now for advocating for diversity, equity, or inclusion. Here's a quote from recently signed legislation that will have a profound impact on education in Florida. Quote, "A Florida college system institution, state university, Florida College System Institution Direct Support Organization, or State University Direct Support Organization may not expend any state or federal funds to promote, support, or maintain any programs or campus activities that A. violate S.1000.05, or B. advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusion, or promote or engage in political or social activism as defined by rules of the State Board of Education and regulations of the Board of Governors," end quote. That's lines 309 through 318, and I include a link to this in the show notes at jaredoleary.com. Now, this proposed legislation is for higher education, but my guess is that K-12 is next. There's a link in the show notes at jaredoleary.com with a curated list of more than 30 anti-DEIA bills that are being proposed or have been passed in different states across the United States. Regardless of where this kind of legislation would occur, how do you teach ethics or algorithmic bias in computing without advocating for equity? How do you talk about accessible computing practices without advocating for inclusion? Do you just avoid certain words when talking about these topics? For example, some CS educators are using the word different instead of the word diverse. But what about pedagogies? Am I able to use culturally relevant pedagogies if I just call it something else? Is all of this just a new form of censorship? If so, they might be able to censor the language without censoring the work, but that doesn't mean it won't have a profoundly negative impact on educators who are already marginalized and have enough forms of oppression to try and manage. How does all of this trickle down and impact the students that we work with? So for example, I've mentioned on this podcast a story of a middle school student who came up to me and was like, "Hey, is it okay if I create a scratch story about two people who are in love?" I was like, "Yeah, that sounds great. Nothing wrong with that." The student was like, "Yeah, but what if it's like two boys that are in love with each other?" And I was like, "Yeah, that's like not a problem." And they're like, "Yeah, but what about administrators? Like, are they going to get mad at me?" Because at the time, there was a law in Arizona that said that teachers could not promote the, quote, homosexual lifestyle. And so this student was afraid that they're going to have some backlash because of the trickle down of policies like that. Even though I told the student, like, "Hey, my wife and I are both in the queer community. I support you 100% through this. If anything comes of this, I will back you up." The student decided not to do that project because they are afraid of the backlash. This has an impact of minimizing who people are, and that's a problem. This kind of legislation and censorship is also having an impact on computer science professional development and curriculum providers. So some PD providers are not changing what they're doing, so they give a caveat that if a teacher needs to leave, they can, so that way the teacher doesn't get in trouble for attending some professional development that has prohibited content in it. Other PD providers are simply removing DEIA content from their PD in states with anti-DEIA laws. If they aren't removing the content entirely, they're leaving it up to the PD facilitator to determine whether or not they want to leave the content in the PD. This, to me, reads as an example of a very large organization with immense political power washing their hands of this problem and saying, it's up to you as a lone individual to determine whether you want to risk teaching this kind of content. And because this very large organization is making it abundantly clear that they're trying to comply with local laws and that they don't want to get in trouble if the individual chooses to provide PD on content that is now labeled as optional, it means that lone individuals are having to stand up for what they might consider to be right, without the backing of a very large organization. The rationale that has been communicated by this organization and by some teachers is that they'd rather have CS that doesn't focus on DEIA than no CS at all. While I agree that something is better than nothing, the sentiment should not end with a period. but with a comma that says no DEIA in CS education is better than no CS at all, comma, but we're going to continue to fight for what's right and change these policies. Imagine if civil rights activists had said segregation in schools is better than no education at all. The idea that something is better than nothing doesn't mean we should fight for what's right. And to get personal here, it's not a far cry to think that someone might try to ban the curricular content I previously created that has been used by hundreds of thousands of students around the world because I'm public about being non-binary, and therefore instructional videos created by someone in the trans community should be banned because they don't want to confuse kids. To be abundantly clear, the only thing I'm confused about is why people can't accept that other people's lived experiences, realities, or ontologies are different than their own. Why should someone like myself be silenced because you're uncomfortable with my existence? How can educators, organizations, etc. rally together to say this is unacceptable? It's a shame that organizations have felt the need to bend to this kind of pressure, but we are stronger when we unite as a field or even partner with other education associations and organizations to say, we're tired of politicians who have never taught a day in their life dictating what is best for teaching and learning. Unfortunately, it's not just policymakers who are having a negative impact on teaching and learning, but large funders of nonprofit organizations. I mentioned this in episode 192, which is titled How to Get Started in Computer Science Education, but I know of several organizations who have privately shared with me that a corporate funder gave their organization money that originally had no strings attached to it, but were later asked to make changes that altered the quality of the PD or curricula so the funder could say they impacted more students and teachers, or because the funder did not want to fund equity-related content. I know it's easy for me to say don't accept this kind of funding because I no longer work for an organization that's dependent on that funding, but it's the same stance that I had when I was working at one. As one person that I know said, I'd rather say no to $10 million from a single funder who wants to change the scope or quality of our mission and instead find 10 donors who each provide $1 million without asking us to change the quality or scope of our mission. This episode was way more political than I've gotten before on this podcast and was much more scripted than usual because I've created enough unscripted content to know that people can wildly misinterpret what I'm trying to communicate. If you didn't enjoy this particular episode, there are nearly 200 more podcast episodes that don't focus on politics, but I genuinely feel that this is an important topic that we need to discuss as a field, because if the PD and curriculum providers are scared, how do you think individual educators feel right now? If you do enjoy this podcast or any of the free content that I create, like the scratch videos on my YouTube channel, the only thing that I ask is that you share it with somebody else who might enjoy that content. I also create a bunch of drumming and gaming stuff. It's all at jaredoleary.com if you're interested in any of that. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. Stay tuned for an episode next week. Until then, I hope you're all staying safe and are having a wonderful week.